The sound of ice hitting glass cut through the quiet of the nursery like a verdict, sharp and sudden, as if the whole house had found a new rhythm, and it was panic. I dropped the stack of illustrated flashcards in my hands and ran, breath burning my chest, shoes slapping the polished floor. There was the smell of antiseptic and cold metal from the stairwell, and something warmer, a small, raw smell of sweat and fear coming from the play corner. He was there, pressed into the curve of a wool rug, knees drawn up, fingers white around a threadbare toy that had seen better days. His hair fell into his eyes, a dark curtain, and his small body trembled like a leaf in wind. The man at the doorway moved with a precision that made the room colder, a suit crisp, posture carved of steel, eyes trained on the child with a detachment like a contract being read. I knew him before the staff said his name, because everyone knew. He was known by the way he took up space, by the hush he bought wherever he went. My hands shook, but I knelt down anyway, lowering myself to be smaller, softer, less like a threat. "It is okay," I said, voice low, the phrase tasting like a promise I had no right to make. The child did not look at me. His jaw worked, his breath shallow. The man in the suit said nothing at first, and in that silence, the nursery felt like the inside of a held breath. I did not know yet that his name was Oliver, that he was 6, or that the quiet he carried had weight enough to tip the world. I only knew this was where everything would begin to break and then to heal. Before I can continue, before you discover what really happened in that second when the whole world seemed to hold its breath, let me talk to you, the one who's here right now, following every detail of this story. If you're feeling that faint shiver, the one that shows up when something important is about to happen, then this story is meant for you. And I need to ask you for something. Stories like this one, deep, intense, filled with emotion and vulnerability, only reach you because there's someone on the other side choosing to support it, and that someone can be you. So if you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe to the channel. It helps more than you can imagine and makes it possible for me to bring the next parts. Like this video, it's just a tap, but to the algorithm, it's like shouting, "I want more." And leave a simple comment down below, "I want part 2," or "continue." Your comment, no matter how small it seems, shows me you're here, living this story with me. And now, if you've already done that, take a deep breath. Because what comes next is where everything begins to change. For the man you don't know yet, but soon will. A man who carries secrets no one dares to touch. The first nights were a study in patience and small language. I learned how to read the edges of his fear, the way his fingers curled when noise approached, the way his shoulders rose before a voice became loud. I sat on the floor for hours and let my presence be a slow tide, not forcing, not reaching, just being. I placed a cup of warm milk near his bed and left it where he could find it. The undertone of the house was chrome and quiet, the staff moving like careful ghosts, footsteps muffled by thick rugs. There was a lullaby I hummed that my grandmother used to sing, a melody that smelled like thyme and wool. And one night the child turned his head toward it, eyes glistening, and mouthed something that could have been the beginning of trust. We made tiny trades with each other, him offering a moment of eye contact for a toy saved from the corner, me offering a story for a bedtime. His silence was not empty. It hummed with meanings I had to learn to translate. And I learned to be patient with translation. The housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, warmed the tea and brought extra blankets. She moved around him with a tenderness that did not demand reciprocity. Mr. Park, the teacher, sat at the little table and silently built block towers until the child stayed a little while. "He remembers the shock of noise," Mr. Park said once, voice low, as if not to disturb even the thought. "Small rituals help, a pattern he can rely on." I found, against my own disbelief, that the child's fingers would sometimes find my sleeve and hold on, a subtle permission like a soft key turning in a lock. Those moments were maps for both of us, and we traced them carefully. When I offered to stay overnight, it felt like stepping off a cliff, both terrifying and necessary. There was negotiation, paperwork, the cold pragmatism of someone in a position of authority suggesting limits, and the warm insistence of something else telling me to push beyond rules. The father, Julian Blackwell, agreed with the methodical economy of his type, his words measured, his consent more of a transaction than a blessing. But he signed the papers that made my presence more enduring. He asked questions about qualifications and schedules, and I answered, keeping my heart tucked into the fold of professional language. In the background, the child watched like a small animal watching the weather. The house was a fortress of glass and pale stone, a house built to impress, not to hold. Bringing a boy who flinched at echoes into it felt like planting a seed in a greenhouse made of ice. Yet when I crossed the threshold without the staff buzzing behind me and set up a small bed in the study, there was a tiny, private sense of rightness. I held my breath and promised the child and myself that I would try a different kind of care, one that would not measure affection in schedules, but in minutes, giving without asking for return. Life in the house moved by invisible rules, and I learned them quickly. The foyer smelt of citrus and polished wood. The library had the dry, leathery scent of money. There were paintings on the walls that watched like patient sentinels. The staff roster read like a cast list for a theater of propriety. Mrs. Chen kept the linens immaculate and knew which spoon the boy liked. Mr. Park brought art supplies from the public school. Daniel, the chauffeur, always parked the car with a mechanical humility, and Sebastian, the security chief, watched the gates like a hawk. I had my routines too, small rituals to anchor the child. A tray with 2 mugs of cocoa, a blanket folded at the foot of the bed, a dinosaur figurine placed where a small hand could find it. In those quiet hours, I let the backstory of my own life unfurl like a slow film. I had grown up in an industrial town, my family enough but not cupped in gold, and I learned early to read faces for soft places. I learned to be the person who shows up, the one who knits together errands and small comforts. My name is Aaron, and I carry a veteran's stiffness in my shoulders, not from war, but from years of holding myself small so as not to be broken by others. I trained as an early childhood caregiver because I believed in the little openings where a life can redirect itself. My hands remember the weight of a child's head, and my voice knows the low register that says, "You are safe." That backstory is a quiet river under everything I do, a long practice of repair and of refusing to leave when things are hard. Julian's past lived in his silence more than his words. Public life had shaped him into a man who could present certainty and control on demand. He was the CEO of a multinational firm, a presence in the news with a name that carried contracts and stock charts. People use the phrase all the time, powerful and reserved, like an adjective. At home, he kept to routines, came and went with appointments and stakeholder meetings, and his hands rarely trembled. But those hands had once been rapid with apologies and absences, a pattern of distance he had thought of as protection. Childhood ghosts were tucked behind his jaw, and a failed engagement years ago left a brittle edge that made him guard his private life like a corporate secret. When we were alone once, he told me, voice low and honest in a way I had not often seen, that he had not learned to be held. He had learned instead to hold others at arm's length to make sure they could not demand parts of him he did not know how to give. That confession came like a small admission, and I filed it away as context for the man who was at once our adversary and our ally. I knew then that the possibility for repair was not just for the boy, but also for the adult who had built a life on certainty and now had to reconfigure his definition of strength. The first breakthrough was a thing of weather and whisper. It happened at night in the tiny kitchen off the study, the room smelling of warm bread and citrus, rain tapping the windows. I was making tea when the child slipped into the doorway, expression unsure, eyes shadowed. He did not move toward Julian, who stood by the window like an island, hands in his pockets. He moved toward me, and for a moment I worried about the jealousy the man might feel. The child held a crumpled drawing, a landscape of heavy blues and jagged shapes, and he placed it on the counter between us. "It is the pond," he said, voice athread, and then his shoulders dropped as if some secret had been told and accepted. We spoke in small exchanges, and the kitchen became a crucible where different versions of family were tried on and found wanting or usable. There were 8 exchanges in that conversation, each one a pebble thrown into our shared water. "Do you like ducks?" I asked. "Sometimes," he said. "Sometimes they fly away." Julian's voice came low. "You do not have to explain him." I replied, "I am not asking him to explain." "He is safe here," Julian said, and then, softer, "I am trying." "It is slow," I said, "but he can try too." The child looked between us, and at last placed his small hand on my forearm, the touch a punctuation. The moment slowed to a hush. I told him a story about a small duck who learned to trust the pond. I told it in words and in touch, and later he fell asleep with his head on my lap. When he slept, the house felt less like a stage and more like shelter. That night, the phrase, "You are safe," became more than something I said. It was a foundation. If the house had a heartbeat, it was slower than the city outside. Days settled into a rhythm of school drop-offs and therapy sessions. We met with a child psychologist, Dr. Ramirez, whose office smelled of chamomile and old paper. She taught me how to scaffold routines, how to name feelings so the child could find them on a map. School teacher Miss Nguyen sent home drawings and a note that said he had answered a question in class, and I carried that paper like proof we were making increments of progress. There were tender moments of domesticity, like when Julian sat at the table for dinner 2 nights in a row because he wanted to be there, not because a calendar reminded him. There were flirtations, small, hesitant things. Julian catching my hand across a pile of papers, a conversation that lingered after a meeting where his laugh escaped before he could rein it back. The housekeeper brought an extra slice of bread and winked. Daniel the chauffeur offered to fix a loose step on the stoop and made a joke about my terrible sense of direction. We learned to be a cluster of imperfect supports. My backstory loomed again in private times, a memory of being the person who picks up the fragments. Julian told me more of his, in pieces. A father who prioritized legacy over hugs. A childhood where silence was measured in hours. These confessions were not dramatic. They were small shifts, a peeling of varnish that revealed a human surface beneath polished wood. The rupture came quiet and then violent. A photo appeared online, taken from a private moment, spun into a headline that questioned Julian's parenting and suggested negligence. The newsroom lights turned into spotlights on our door. An anonymous account started feeding rumors, implying that I was not only a caregiver but an opportunist, and within a day the story had a life of its own. The world outside the walls hummed with speculation. I felt the atmosphere change in the house, like a storm moving in. Phones rang with lawyers on the other end. Security plans were revised, and Julian's face went white in a way I had seen before when a boardroom turned against him. The child's breathing changed. He had learned to anticipate loud noises. In those hours, I had the visceral taste of fear on my tongue, a metallic flavor that did not belong to any food. I walked room to room, checking locks, speaking in circles of reassurance. There was a man at the gate, a former rival of Julian's, who sent messages like barbed gifts. He demanded payment for silence and hinted at deeper secrets. It was a manipulation that smelled like revenge. Sebastian, the security chief, moved like a shadow, calling contacts and arranging protection. We found out later that the leak had come from a disgruntled contractor with access to private feeds. That discovery came with relief and fresh anger, but in the moment the pressure tightened like a band. The kitchen became our war room and sanctuary. One night the child woke screaming, haunted by a memory of hands he could not name. I scooped him up, smelling the late-night coffee on Julian and the copper tang of adrenaline in the air. "You are safe," I said, as I had learned to say, and wrapped him in a towel because it was the nearest warm thing. Julian was there, hands large and uncoordinated with tenderness, and he said, "Tell me what to do." There was an exchange of 10 short lines between us, urgent and simple, laying down roles as if mapping them would make them real. "Hold him," I said. "Talk softly." "I will not leave," he promised. "Then do not," I told him. The child birthed the smallest sound of relief, a sound like a key finding a lock. That night we held each other and the house breathed with us. The moment was a rupture healing itself while still raw. Two adults learning how to be a shelter for a small person who had been taught not to expect protection. It felt like a first lesson in a new grammar of family. The man who sought to use our privacy against us escalated. He orchestrated a confrontation by the lake on a day when fog lay thick, a scene staged like a movie where he thought he would win both publicity and leverage. He took the child, arguing he had the right to meet privately, and for a heartbeat the lake was a wide mouth of possibility and terror. We did not wait for the police to move with their slow machinery. Julian chose action that surprised his boardroom persona. He charged across the grass with the rawness of someone who finally understood what it meant to protect beyond reputation. I followed, breath burning, Sebastian close behind. Words were thrown like small knives, and then it became physical, a scramble near the reeds where the water smelled of mud and old leaves. The kid was small and furious, clinging to a man who promised him something frightening. The confrontation detailed like a staccato sequence of breaths and splashing, and we counted out loud to steady ourselves. "Let go," I demanded, voice steady though my heart raced. "You are scaring him." Julian's hand found my shoulder, and for a second I felt the weight of his insistence. "Back," the rival hissed, and a fist swung wide. In the moments that stretched and snapped like old film, Sebastian and Daniel intervened, pulling bodies apart while the child cried a sound that made us all thin with guilt. The police arrived after. The paperwork began, cameras flashed. The rival was charged with unlawful restraint and harassment based on evidence we provided, surveillance footage that showed the sequence in cold, indisputable clarity. The legal process was noisy and painful, but it also was precise, an instrument that cut through rumor and restored a line where truth could stand. The court scene was a corridor of bright lights and careful faces, a place where my voice felt small and exact. We presented the footage, Dr. Ramirez explained the patterns of trauma, and our lawyer, Ms. Alvarez, framed it in law that moved like a tide, authoritative and steady. The press tried to make theater of it, but the facts were heavy stones that sank the lies. Julian stood in that spotlight and spoke in a way that surprised him as much as it did me, admitting his mistakes and asserting his duty. The rival lost power in cold legal charges. The face of truth, and the judge issued a restraining order and fines. The public narrative shifted from scandal to vindication, and the hashtag that had once bidden at our doors turned into a message of support and apology when the full story came out. In the quieter aftermath, Julian approached me with an object he had kept hidden, a small ring that belonged to his grandmother and that he had carried as a talisman. He told me, voice thick, that he wanted to formalize what we had become, not for the sake of legalities, but to promise a new shape of family. Our conversation there had the cadence of confession and of hope. "I never learned how to stay," he said. "Teach me." "We will teach each other," I replied. He slipped the ring into my hand, then onto my finger, clumsy at first. And when he asked, "Will you marry me?" it was not a spectacle, but a small, private thing, asked in the kitchen where the boy had fallen asleep months before. The epilogue unfolds in 3 small, persistent acts of time. 1 month later, the house smells differently in a way that is not attributable to soap, but to the presence of routine. The boy eats breakfast without being urged, the spoon scraping the bowl a steady little sound in the kitchen. Mrs. Chen hums as she works, and Daniel leaves little drawings on the front seat of the car. Julian comes home because he wants to, and we set 3 places at the table with the slight absurdity of new tradition. The child speaks one new word, not monumental, but the first syllable of trust. I keep a journal of the small things, a paper trail of triumphs that are tiny enough to fit between the pages. The neighborhood watches differently now, kinder, because the worst of the scandal has been replaced by stories of care. The house is less a fortress and more a home, less polished and more worn in the nicest way, like a shirt that finally fits. 3 months later, the therapy notes show progress that is not linear, but real. The child draws a family, with stick figures holding hands, and he names us all. Julian has taken a leave from some of his external duties, using his influence instead to create a foundation for childhood trauma research, something practical that channels guilt into action. We throw a small birthday party with neighbors, Miss Nguyen bringing cupcakes, and Sebastian pretending to be gruff while he organizes party games. The child laughs at a joke Daniel tells, a laugh that echoes and feels like music in the rooms where sorrow once lodged. There are nights when the boy wakes and calls for me by name, and I go, heart soft, knowing that my presence is now a shape he can find without panic. We plan, in small increments, a life that includes school plays and dinner routines and Saturday mornings, the pond where we watch ducks and do not expect them to fly away. Our terms of love are negotiated daily, in cups of tea and in apology notes left under pillows. Julian learns how to be present with the clumsy grace of someone practicing a new language. He says, often, "I used to think I had to be unbreakable," and then he smiles. "Now I think I can be honest." I answer, "Honesty is a shelter too." 6 months later, the house holds the sound of a small ritual that had once seemed impossible. On a warm afternoon, we stand in the garden with friends who have been with us through the storms. Mrs. Chen beside us with a handkerchief, Dr. Ramirez smiling, Miss Nguyen clutching a paper crown the child insists on wearing. The ceremony is simple, nothing extravagant, a promise by vows that are less about performance and more about stewardship. The ring Julian gives is not an attempt to repair alone, but a symbol of the family we choose. The child walks between us and places his small hand into each of ours. And for a moment, the world is nothing but the warmth of skin and the cool of leaves. The press are there but distant, content to report on a reconciliation that is honest. We build a daily life that has mistakes and grace, and we institute safety measures that make the child feel protected, not caged. Regular therapy sessions, a trusted circle of adults named and known, and backyard time measured by play rather than by surveillance. The house, once a stage, becomes a living room of memories. The man who thought power was measure enough learns to count time in small domestic details. I learned that love is a set of practices more than a feeling, that the promise I made in a nursery the night I first saw him tremble was an anchor, and that promises are kept through repetition and patience. There are still echoes of the old wounds. The boy startles at sudden sounds. Julian sometimes freezes when a boardroom issue threatens his composure, and I have nights when worry settles heavy like rain. But our life is a fabric stitched with hands large and small, with community members named and present. If you felt the throb in your chest when he finally laid his head on my lap, you are not alone. Share in the comments the simple thing that moved you today. Start your sentence with, "The gesture that touched me was," because small acts of witness matter. If this story reached you, subscribe for more stories of repair and resilience, for narratives that show how people can reconstruct family in the aftermath of fear. We learn to say, "You are safe" every day, until the words carried weight, and that is the promise we keep.